hosting this event. This is a great space. I've actually never been here. Something that we've really long known, the fact that the left has to be the kind of movement to take us to something better. So this is a question that we've really been grappling with, thinking about how do we actually get from this desire for something better to actually getting to something better. And so this is, can you still hear me in the back? Okay, so this is kind of what we were thinking in the issue, and so to really think about how to get someplace better and think about sort of where the left fits in with that, we decided that we needed to both look backward in time to think about why we haven't actually successfully created a viable workers' party or labor party in the United States, and really sort of explore these questions, but also to look forward, right, and to see, you know, we heard a lot of voices this year and a lot of people talking about the kind of society they want and a vision for something better. So really reaching out to our contributors to try to think about what would a radical platform look like that really challenges the elite status quo and really challenges the power of capital to, you know, sort of set the conditions for working people in this country. So this issue, in this sense, is kind of doing both things. Really looking backwards and trying to get a sense of sort of why we're in the place we're at, but also a hopeful vision of looking forward and thinking about, you know, what would a radical stance on housing, jobs, education, finance, and the environment, and healthcare, and you know, the carceral state, and fighting sexism, what would that actually look like? So part of the issue is exploring this. This is also kind of an exciting issue, and I urge you to take. We're selling issues in the back for $10, a little bit of a discount promo. But this is also kind of an exciting issue because it's sort of a reboot for Jacobin. This is our 6th year. I haven't been with Jacobin since the beginning, but some people here have been. And so it's a little bit of an exciting issue because it's a new format. We're trying out some new things, and there's a lot of new content in the issue. So definitely take a look in the back. So what we're going to do, I'm not going to talk for much longer just because I want to give Seth some time to talk. So he'll talk for about 25 minutes. And then if you would, anytime during the presentation, if you have a question that you would like to ask, you can just raise your hand and we'll pass you a note card, and you can write down your question. That way at the end we can, you know, really get a chance to sort of see and hear what you have to say. So we'll give Seth a chance to answer your questions. I'll probably pose a few questions to him as well, and then afterward we'll have a chance to talk with each other. So in the back, some of you I see have already gotten beer, but we're selling beer and wine for a suggested donation of $3 in the back. And we also have the table in the back, so if you want to check out, you can buy the issue. We have some back issues and also some books from the Jacobin series. And the ABCs of Socialism are back there as well. So definitely take a look if you're interested. So I'm very happy tonight, actually. I'm meeting Seth for the first time, even though we sort of virtually know each other, to introduce Seth Ackerman, who is on the editorial board of Jacobin. He's been here since the beginning. And he's also a doctoral candidate in history at Cornell. And so Seth is going to talk about his really fabulous piece that he wrote for the issue, and then I might sort of pose a few questions to him at the end. But again, thank you all for coming, and without further ado, Seth.
The article has been on the web now. It's been up on the website for a little while. Maybe some of you have read it. I can say that looking back on it, I wrote it at a time, mostly during the Democratic primaries, and at the time, one of the things that was kind of propelling me forward and made me decide to put these thoughts down on paper was the Sanders campaign. Bernie Sanders was presenting a message that was not especially radical, but he was presenting some ideas of a kind of a classic, simple, conventional social democratic set of ideas and a kind of politics and a kind of rhetoric, a kind of a more class conscious kind of political campaign in his rhetoric than we are accustomed to, than I've seen for pretty much my whole life in American politics. And the response that he got for that campaign was really inspiring to a lot of people, and surprised a lot of people. Surprised a lot of people on the left who were almost surprised to hear ideas that we had been talking about for a long time not only be expressed by a politician with the attention of the whole national stage, but actually meeting with a lot of popularity. And so at the time that I was writing it, I was expecting that by the time the piece would be published, Hillary Clinton would be president, and that expectation, I was sort of anticipating that it would be published in an atmosphere, a political atmosphere that would be a lot different than what we're facing now. And in a lot of ways, the situation we're facing now, definitely sets us back. Not just in terms of the straightforward reasons that we're going to be facing a lot more forthrightly reactionary policies and political climate, but also in terms of the kind of reaction that inevitably produces on the left, which is a reaction of defensiveness necessarily, rather than looking forward to more aggressively organizing and putting our ideas out there in an affirmative way rather than just a negative way. Nevertheless, I think that the feeling still remains on the left that something different happened this year, that there's something that was brewing and that maybe hasn't gone away entirely. And a lot of people were asking, especially at the time when Sanders lost and Clinton was going to be the nominee and it looked like it was back to kind of politics as normal. And a lot of people on the left there was this kind of an upsurge of people asking, well, what do we do now? This has to continue in one way or another after the election. And that was the reason why I ended up putting down these ideas on paper. And in a lot of ways, the debates that were happening on the left at that time, when people were saying, well, what should we do now? It was a lot of deja vu for me, because every 4 years, as long as I can remember being on the left, some of the most, strangely enough, some of the most divisive and strident debates that you get are debates over these issues of what you'd think would be kind of sort of bland or dry issues about third parties versus working within the Democratic Party. When people talk about electoral strategies, which in many ways is not really what the left is about at its core. It's just a way of presenting ideas to the public in a way that's appropriate for the kind of political system we have, for the democracy we have. But that's not really what's at the core, and yet it's essential. It's essential to be able to present a left-wing program, not just among ourselves or at the level of organizing or activism on a day-to-day basis, but to the entire broad public. And so the debates that happen about whether to join an existing third party or form a new third party on the one hand, and the age-old standby of working within the Democratic Party is a debate that seems to repeat itself identically every 4 years. I think the reason why it repeats itself and never seems to evolve or advance, the arguments are always the same on both sides, is because, in fact, both sides are saying that the other side is wrong, and both sides are right. They're right. All of the arguments that both sides muster are correct, and that's what I think lends the flavor of kind of frustrated bile sometimes. Is that that's the reason why the arguments just don't advance. And the standard arguments, which I talk a little bit about in my piece, are that on the one hand, advocates of third parties make a very correct and vital point, which is that in order to coherently present a set of ideas that are different from what 99% of Americans are familiar with as politics, you need to have a party of your own. That's what a party has always been about since the dawn of mass politics. It's been an institution whose purpose, forget about the rules or the legal formalisms about how the party is organized or anything like that. If you go back and read Marx Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, the number one recommendation, the one thing that they urge is for workers to form a party of their own. And they certainly weren't talking about ballot lines or anything like that. That was beside the point. For them, what a party was simply a group of people who joined together behind a common program, a common political vision, presented it to the public, and pledged that they would advance that program. And if they ran candidates for public office, that meant that those candidates were members of that party and would be pledged to advance that program, that platform. That's all a party was. And that's all a party really was in the history of democratic or mass politics up until quite recently, when it became much more institutionalized. If you don't have that, if you don't have your own party, then there's, right off the bat, an enormous amount that you simply cannot do. And there's an enormous amount that you find yourself forced to do that is actually frustrating your aims. And so I think that is the core of what is correct in the arguments of those who say that working within the Democratic Party one way or another, running candidates here or there, getting behind whoever the latest progressive flavor of the month politician is, who's supposedly the next great hope, and they run glowing profiles of that person in the nation or whatever, is not actually getting us further. Those politicians may be sincere people. They may have, in many ways, decent politics. They may even do good things, which in some ways makes the argument even tougher, because those things are often real. We'd much rather have, I'm sure, Bill de Blasio than Rudolph Giuliani as mayor of the city, to take one example of a progressive flavor of the month. So that's I think the core of what is true and good in the argument for a third party. But of course, the argument in response is always the same also, and that argument is, well, if you form a third party, you will be, number one, you'll be a spoiler. It means that from just a straightforward point of view, if you run a third party in an election at whatever level we're talking about, it could be the presidential level, which for some reason we end up talking about 10 times more than all of the other levels that are actually much more likely to generate some kind of a traction with left politics. Well, it could be all the way down to the state legislature or local government. If you run a third party against a Democrat in a race where there's a Republican, then 9 times out of 10 you're going to draw votes away from the Democrat, make it more likely that you elect a Republican, and the result is going to be not only bad on the merits in terms of who you end up making the more likely wins, but the results will also be that your constituency, the people that you want to attract, the people that we want to attract to a left program, who count on the political process for nothing else, if not to at least spare them from the worst of what American politics can inflict on the kinds of populations that make up the natural constituency of the left. Those people will not be attracted to the prospect of making it more likely that a Giuliani type or a Trump type will win office and be able to implement their program. And that argument is true too. That argument is also valid. So I think these are and the reason why we're here is because the system that we're facing, the electoral system that we're facing, puts us in this dilemma and requires or puts us in a position where the left ends up having these same arguments over and over and over again. One of the main points that I wanted to make in this piece is that, number one, this spoiler problem is really not, in many ways, the main problem. It's a major problem, but it's not the main problem. And in fact, if you look at the history of party politics on the left, the spoiler problem always existed. And if it were a fatal obstacle to the formation of left-wing parties in the kind of multi-party politics that we're familiar with, then there never would have been left-wing parties anywhere in the world. People often talk about the idea that, well, we have a winner-take-all system. We have a first-past-the-post system, and that's the reason. If we had proportional representation or something like that, it's often the argument that's used by the opponents of third parties. What that ignores is that actually how do those countries get proportional representation in the first place? It's not as if they always had it. In fact, proportional representation is a brand new idea that only dates from, I think, the earliest, sometime around 1900. And the vast majority of countries that have a proportional representation system and have had electoral politics going back before that, they originally had the same kind of electoral system we do. Winner-take-all systems are sort of the old traditional system. And the reason they ended up getting proportional representation, or whatever other system they have, is precisely because left-wing parties entered the political field and forced the mainstream parties of the time, which, when it came to the sort of the main competitor of the left wing of the left, the main competitor in the mainstream, I'm talking the late 19th century, early 20th century, those were liberal parties. And those liberal parties found that the spoiler problem was their problem. Once labor parties, working class parties entered the fold, started competing in elections, the spoiler problem then became a threat to the mainstream parties, to the liberal parties, and they were the ones who ended up pushing through proportional representation or things like that in the countries where that ended up happening. But in some countries that never even happened. And look at the Labour Party, for example. A topical example, I think, right now. The Labour Party is the British Labour Party I'm talking about is a party in a system that has always, from day one, been a winner-take-all system. And when the Labour Party was organized at the beginning of the 20th century, Britain was a two-party system, a really hard two-party system. It was just liberals and conservatives. And the liberals were much more sympathetic to the labor movement than the conservatives, much more. In fact, there were a bunch of trade unionists who would get elected to parliament under the liberal label. Nevertheless, the labor movement organized a third party, they didn't call it that, and they fielded those candidates against the liberals, and starting out from a tiny number of votes when in their first electoral outing, 1900 or so, over the next 20 years, eventually the Labour Party surpassed the Liberals, and by now, today, it's the Liberal Party that is the third party in Britain. So clearly that's not the central problem. What makes the United States different from that, what is one of them, of course there's a lot of things that make the United States different, but in terms of how our elections work, the United States is different in most respects from every single other country that has an elected government. And that is our unique electoral system, which has no counterpart elsewhere. In the American system, there are a few things that are completely unique. One of them is that in the United States, we are the only democracy that has a fusion where the political parties are actually organisms of the government. The term Democratic Party, Republican Party is written in the Electoral Code. And the parties, including the third parties that are officially registered and on the ballot, have a whole internal procedure in terms of how they elect the people who run their party machinery, how they elect the people who are going to be their candidates for office. That is all administered. The elections are administered by the government. To give you some context of how that is seen, how that's perceived by people from other countries who have sort of a normal democratic electoral system, that would be like saying, oh, the ACLU or the NAACP, of course, they have to have their elections for their leadership run by the government, with the rules set by the government, and they have to pass their internal bylaws and constitution. It has to pass muster with the state legislature. Well, obviously, that would not normally be considered compatible with the usual standards of freedom of association, basic rights of freedom of association. In the United States, we don't have those basic rights of freedom of association. In order to have the name of a political party on the ballot, that so-called party surrenders its rights to govern its own affairs, to decide how it selects its candidates, and even to choose who can be a quote-unquote member or not, all to the state legislature. Who runs the state legislatures? Obviously, a little bit more than 99% of the members of the state legislatures in this country who write those rules are Democrats and Republicans. And the result is exactly what you would expect. The result is that the rules that have been instituted, not only in terms of how parties can be run internally, how they select their candidates and so on, but even the mere getting on the ballot is deliberately set. Those rules are deliberately set in such a way, government printed ballot that the voter sees when the voter shows up to the polls. The ballot line is not an issue that has anything to do with winner-take-all elections, first past the post, anything like that. Nor is that a system that dates back to the Constitution, and so you need a constitutional amendment to change it or something like that. As I discuss at length in my piece, and I can't go into all the detail, but that whole system with the ballot line and all of this dates only to about the 1890s at the earliest. Starting in the 1890s, there was every state by state, every state ended up having a wave of so-called reforms that were instituted by the bosses of the two parties in the state governments, faced with an internal crisis of the Democratic and Republican political parties, in which the internal integrity of those parties was being destabilized, and some challenges from outside those parties, from populist parties and other kinds of parties. The result was a set of reforms that essentially made permanent and institutional the dominance of the existing two parties. And the means of doing that was to control the ballot, as well as to control the internal affairs of the parties in terms of how they select their candidates and all the rest of it. So the upshot of what I'm proposing in this article, and I mean you can read the details in the piece, but the upshot of it is to step back from this argument, this perennial argument on the left about third parties versus working within the Democratic Party, and to realize that that entire argument is premised on the idea, which I want to argue is a completely false idea, in which, in many ways, to believe it is to fall into the trap of exactly the people within the major parties, within the official parties, who set up this system that's designed to make other parties fail. This illusion that somehow the name of the party on the ballot is having that name, having that government imprimatur of having that name on there on the ballot, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, whatever, that is the essence of what a political party is. And it's not. That's not at all the essence of a political party, and that's not it has nothing to do with why we would want to form a left-wing political party in the first place. We go back to what Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto. They didn't say anything about make sure that your party name is on the ballot. Back then they didn't have official ballots anyway. People just drop slips of paper into a box. That had nothing to do with it. What makes a party and what makes it something that we want is simply that it is an organization of like-minded people with common interests and common ideals who come together, form an institution, an organization that presents a vision of politics to the public that says we can live in a different type of society. Here's what we want. Here's why it's appealing. And to pledge themselves to these common goals, and when they run candidates, in addition to all the other things they do, which would be far more than just running candidates for elections. But in addition to all that, when they do run candidates for elections, those candidates are members of the party, they're accountable to the party, and they're pledged to respect that platform and advance that vision of society. I give some details in my piece about how exactly I think that should be done in terms of the institutional details. I guess since I have a couple minutes left, I might as well just say that it's not even it's exactly as you would expect. You form an organization, you incorporate it, and one of the great things that makes this sort of venture much more plausible today, even than it would have been just 10 or 20 years ago, is the details of how the campaign finance system in this country have changed. 20 years ago, the campaign finance system was governed entirely by a law, the Federal Elections Campaign Act, which was written by the two parties and which was deliberately intended, just like the ballot laws, to perpetuate the advantages of the incumbent parties. And the Supreme Court, the right-wing Supreme Court, in its infinite wisdom, decided a few years ago that it was going to basically eviscerate that law, that set of laws. Before Citizens United, it would have been actually very difficult for any organization to do what I'm proposing, for the reason of fundraising, because any act of spending money in the course of campaigning or running candidates for office would have triggered those laws, and those laws are in various ways that I talk about a little bit, stacked against any independent party. Today, those laws don't matter. That law, the FECA, doesn't matter at all. And so, if you look at the fundraising effort that Bernie Sanders' campaign ended up undertaking, which stunned the Clinton world, stunned the Democratic Party in terms of the vast number of people who were willing to donate just $20 or $30 to advance this kind of a message. That sort of fundraising, along with money from unions and money from just the broader public, could do all of the things that money does for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party today. And when it comes to the ballot line, that organization, when they decide to run candidates, would treat the issue on a purely case-by-case basis. There are some places where it would make sense to run candidates in Democratic primaries. There are other places where it would make sense to run candidates as nonpartisan independents, which incidentally is much easier to get on the ballot as a nonpartisan independent than it is to get on the ballot as a third party, in part because the state legislatures don't like the idea that the ballot serves as kind of like a free advertising for whatever other party by putting their name on there. So an independent candidate, the rules are much laxer. Yet, all of these candidates would be presented to the electorate in the 99% of people's lives when they're not standing in a voting booth, presented to the public as this is a candidate of our organization, our party, that has this name and this logo and this platform and this set of ideals, this set of leaders and spokespeople, and would divorce the whole issue from this 120-year-old set of binding regulations that's been causing us so much difficulty for so long. I think I'm pretty much out of time, so if you want to be ready. I thought that was a good wrap-up.
All right. All right. Thank you, Seth. I saw a few note cards being passed around, but don't be shy. If you have a question, just raise your hand and Jason will give you a card. I have a couple questions here that, funnily enough, sort of segue directly into the questions that I wanted to ask you. So maybe we'll just pose them and kind of fit them together. So my sort of thinking, as I was reading your piece, which I liked a lot, was just if we think about the persistence of this sort of two-party duopoly, if we want to call it that, which I think is a good way to characterize it. We still see over time sort of fluctuations in the power of working people, and on the left a sort of persistent kind of message and argument about the importance of rooting social movements in the working class, right? Not because we romanticize working people, but because of their sort of structural relationship to capital. So when we think about sort of the organizational questions of at the root of building a new movement, where do you see sort of working people, and in particular organized labor, in kind of moving in a new direction?
Yeah, in principle, the type of the organization that the kind of structure that I'm proposing is something that anyone with any kind of politics could establish with any kind of a constituency. I mean, there could be the anti-Trump right could set up their own version of this, or the pro-Trump right could set up their version of it. I mean, it's a sort of, in itself, it's a neutral organizational structure, and so then the question about how the left should approach the relationship with organized labor, with workers, goes back to ancient issues on the left about what is still the relationship of the labor movement and the working class as a class to left-wing politics. I would say that it's a difficult situation we're in, obviously, because the weaker that the labor movement gets, the less predisposed it is and the less able it is to undertake the kind of aggressive and more militant type of politics that constitutes a left-wing politics. They sink deeper and deeper into the kind of becoming adjunct or auxiliaries to the Democratic Party and whoever runs the Democratic Party at a given moment. That being said, I happen to think, and I could be wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. I happen to think that the scale of the venture that would be required organizationally and in terms of organization, in terms of scale geographically across many different places, and in some ways scale demographically, in terms of the social distance between the various groups of people all across the country who in significant numbers would have to be attracted to a project like this in order to make it have any chance of success. I do think that that the labor move, some part of the labor movement, if no part of the labor movement was somewhere near the core of the project, it's hard for me to imagine it getting off the ground. If it were, I mean, if we were talking about like the right wing, they don't, you know, they've got billionaires and they've got you know, every local town, whoever owns the local car dealership or whoever owns the local, you know, chain of like chicken restaurants is like the natural constituency of the right. And so they have a built-in network of people who are, and those people are often quite class conscious for their class. For us, the labor movement, it's hard, it may not be impossible, but it's hard for me to see what substitute in terms of the organizational muscle could serve as something that would allow a project like this to succeed at a national scale anyway. Maybe not locally, but at a national scale.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there's actually a couple similar questions, meaning that a couple people are asking the same question, which is related to labor, but a little bit different. So thinking about, they're really asking questions about power and sort of how we can understand sort of the potential power of working people. So the kinds of questions here that I'm seeing are, here, like this one for example, so sort of what does the social contract look like when labor is no longer has a sort of bargaining chip of actually removing its ability to work, right? So thinking about automation and this the impact that this may have on the power of working people. How does this inform our sort of organizational questions, or does it?
I think this is a better question for you, isn't it? This is your area, no?
Well, yes, but they didn't ask me.
No, I mean, I can try. I won't.
Oh, you try.
I won't give as good an answer as you probably would. I don't know. I don't. You know, it's true. Historically, I'm a historian, and it's my instinct is always to look at the past for at least sort of ideas and models or structure, you know, similarities and things like that. Historically, it's hard to find a lot of situations in which sustained, long-term, massive political economic change could be brought about without, if not the labor movement, the organized labor movement, some sector of society that has a structural on which the rest of society has a structural dependence, deciding to collectively organize and withdraw whatever it is that they provide that is essential for that society to function. So without that kind of muscle, obviously any oppositional movement is much weaker. So as far as what, you know, there's an infinite literature in the last several decades as labor has gotten weaker in many countries, proposing or offering potential substitutes of where that kind of oppositional impetus could come from, and I don't have one idea that's better than another. But something like that, some strategic resource for society would have to be under the control of some group of people who are part of this organization for which the threat of it. But let me even set that aside. I think that in order for a venture like this to succeed, the people who are members of it need to be bound together by something more than just common ideals, more than just shared political opinions, shared political views. You know, in this room, we probably have a pretty pretty high degree of shared political views, at least compared to whatever other room most people here were last in or are going to be in next time. But in some ways, that's the whole problem, is that the more you share political views, if that's the only thing that you share, and if you don't share common interests, things that are really at stake, so that, if you lose an election, if the person who won the election is not the person you wanted, and that's a real bummer. I mean, I've been depressed for the last while. Not that I was thrilled about Hillary Clinton winning, but I mean, it's been depressing. Felt bleak. Nevertheless, I have a lot less at stake than a lot of other people do, and I certainly don't have as much at stake in terms. I'm not part of an institution made up of other people for which we have a common a common venture going, that if we lost it, something major would be lost. I mean, I can give you an example. The populist movement, the People's Party in the 1890s, was a movement of the was a political party. The People's Party was a party launched by a pre-existing movement that was the cooperative movement, and the base, these were farmers, and the farmers had in this cooperative movement all collectively mortgaged their farms that most of them owned some small farm, and they all placed a collective mortgage on it so that in order to finance a consumer cooperative so that they could purchase supplies at lower prices and defeat the monopolies and stuff like that. Which meant that if they defaulted, if this consumer cooperative failed, then they would all lose the one thing that they owned, the one thing that they gave them some sort of independence. And the fact that they had this thing in common at stake was what gave the People's Party such a tremendous, massive degree of commitment on the part of so many people. So that the kind of arguments that the left gets into about every possible nuance of politics, and so that you see left-wing organizations break up, dissolve in acrimony over issues that were not even considered an important one when the organization was first founded. That stuff gets put aside when people have really important things in their lives at stake other than just their political ideals. If you don't have that, if you just have a bunch of people who get together and say, oh, we share generally the same politics, I think that's kind of a recipe for disaster. Again, I could be wrong, but that's my impression.
Okay, wow, we have a lot of really good questions here. I was just trying to group them a bit topically. So there's a few questions here. And if people want to chat about automation after, I am happy to talk about it. But there are a lot of really interesting questions here that I want to give people sort of some voice. So there are a number of questions about the Tea Party and whether that as a sort of collective or organization or constellation, however we want to define it, is kind of doing something that the left might learn some examples from, or if they're actually sort of thinking outside of the duopoly in a creative way. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the Tea Party is an interesting case. I still think there's been a lot of books written about it already, even though it just happened a few years ago. And I still think that the whole story of the Tea Party probably still hasn't been written. That more will be learned. Obviously, the Tea Party was not a party. There was no Tea Party organization that was the organization of the Tea Party. In the end, there was a proliferation of organizations, half of which were like, scam artists. The right wing has this tendency to like end up as a series of like con games for like elderly people that can be easily built out of their money. So there was a lot of that in the end. On the other hand, so there was a lot of different groups, and they were very resistant to centralization. That's one thing that you often heard from the Tea Party. We don't want to create one single organization. We value our local autonomy. In the end, I doubt that ended up playing a positive role for them. What did end up playing a positive role for them, which I still think the scholars or researchers or whatever haven't gone to the bottom to, but it's something worth keeping in mind. So I remember that sort of the peak of the Tea Party's influence, 2010 maybe. The Washington Post did a big investigation, I don't know if investigation is the right word, a study, I guess, where they surveyed all of the Tea Party groups around the country, tried to compile an exhaustive list of them, and then actually contacted them to see what these groups were about. And there was I found it surprising, and I have to say impressive, that there were, I forget what the number was, but there was a huge number of local groups that were not just somebody set up a website somewhere, but they actually met every other week in a place like this. And what do they do? I mean, again, these people are it's like all like 67-year-old people for the most part. That was like the average age in general. But they would go to a place like this, and they would watch a patriotic film, and sometimes they would have a local politician come and you talk to them, and they would ask questions. In some ways, it doesn't even really matter what they did. It was the fact that they were doing something, that they were meeting together on a regular basis, face to face, that gave, and not all of them probably who were meeting in the room ended up being hardcore activists who were working on it every day, but I think that compared to a lot of, sort of movements that get bandied ballyhooed on the left, there was, my suspicion is that in some ways the Tea Party was more organized in that sense, just in the sense that they would meet and had a real sort of physical presence that maybe accounted for whatever success they did have. But in the end, I don't know, the Tea Party, it certainly wasn't it wasn't a political party, it wasn't a party within the party. Most of what the Tea Party was pushing the Republican Party to do, the leaders of the Republican Party already wanted to do, and just maybe felt that they couldn't go that far or something. I don't think that's exactly an analogous situation to what we're in. Not at all. I mean, a lot of what we would want to be done, Democratic leaders actively work behind the scenes to make sure those things don't happen. Anyway, those are my thoughts. I'm not an expert.
Okay, there's quite a few questions about Bernie here. So just in general, there's some questions asking about the potential of his fundraising model and the kind of mass base he generated and sort of, the extension of that, thinking about our revolution and what kind of going forward, if you think there's any kind of potential in that.
Yeah, it's funny. I I have a line in the article where it's this kind of a skeptical paragraph in my article about our revolution, which I didn't really know that much about. I had just sort of heard the general gist of it at the point when I wrote it, because I was concerned, and I guess to some extent there's still grounds for concern that it would end up just being another kind of MoveOn.org or whatever the various other equivalents of that are. And I have to say that just the other day I heard, what is the name of the former head of this communication workers? Larry Cohen, yeah. I heard Larry Cohen, former head of the Communication Workers of America, who's a union that supported Bernie Sanders, and Cohen is close to Bernie Sanders, and Cohen is now on the board of Our Revolution. I heard an interview with him on Doug Henwood's radio show, where he just basically laid out what exactly they do. And I have to say, it's not what I'm proposing here. It's not nearly as ambitious, and I'm sure that was a deliberate decision on his part of Sanders. I don't think that he thinks that the left, his left, the left, our left, is ready for that. For the kind of thing that I'm proposing. I doubt that he thinks that we're there yet. But I was surprised, favorably surprised by what Cohen says that they do, because it's not unlike my understanding of what MoveOn and Democrats for America and those kinds of groups, which are it's a staff. There's a small staff of people who get salaries in most of those groups, and they have a giant email list, and then they send you emails all the time, about the latest outrage or urging you to send money or telling you that there's a bill up that you should write letters to your congressman and whatever. Whereas what Cohen was saying is that they have this giant list, but what they're mostly interested in is 1 million local activist groups in lots of different places, not just in New York City or San Francisco or whatever, but in places all across the country that are doing various things, and they try to connect those groups so that they give emails to it's not just that they're collecting emails, but they give the emails to the local groups so they can get in touch with each other at the state level and coordinate and do things like that. They also support some electoral work, including a lot of certain ambitious that I'm proposing here. Those things all sound like the kinds of things that should be done. And so, since I heard all of that, and maybe other people here know more, and maybe they've heard terrible things about the organization, and I should know about them. But I was actually favorably impressed with what they're doing. But what they're doing is not what I'm proposing, which is something on a sort of a grander scale. Okay.
So I'm going to just relate these two questions, even though they're not exactly the same question. One is sort of a comment that this room is very white, and I might also say very male. So the broader question of sort of how this is linking to another question, how do you actually foresee a new kind of left-wing politics overcoming the kind of vast cultural, if we want to lump it that way, differences that we really kind of are seeing, particularly, conversations now with the victory of Trump. So how does these kinds of questions sort of, how do we tie them in with a conversation about organization?
Yeah, I think that's like probably the $10 million question of all the questions. I have to say that I don't have if I had the answer, I guess I wouldn't have $1 million, but if I had the answer to that question, I would still be here. But if I knew the answer to that question, no, it's a really good question. I have to say that I think that what I'm proposing here, I see if we were in a position to launch it and do it and have it succeed the way that it ought to, it would be potentially, or something like it would be potentially the solution to the problem, or part of the solution, in the sense that with the existing political system, first of all, the vast majority of Americans all they understand about politics is what they see phenomenally through the two parties and their constant bickering. That's it. That's how people understand politics. That's one of the main reasons why getting involved in electoral politics is a good idea in the first place, despite all of the bad things about it, is that only when people are contending for power do the vast majority of people have any reason to pay attention to those people. No matter how good your opinion is, my opinion about what ought to be done, about what's terrible about America today, and how it should be righted, I can put my opinions on the internet. I do put my opinions on the internet, but there's a million other people with their opinions, and there's just lots of opinions on the internet, and the vast majority of people have no particular reason to pay attention to any of that. And one of the things that in terms of the particular question I was asked is, one of the worst things about the status quo of the particular set of images and phenomena that people are exposed to as politics in this constant bickering between the Democrats and the Republicans is that in many ways the Democrats and Republicans take the working class and they sort of divvy them up between each other. They say, you have those and we'll take these, and then each side will ally our part of the working class with our donors, and you ally your part of the working class with your donors. And it's kind of ingenious, actually. Because that is what politics looks like to most people, including working class people on whatever side of the divvying up that those people happen to be, it's very seductive. It seems like normal. It seems like that's what political cleavages are like. That's what the political divisions are like. That's what politics is about. If there were an alternative, if there were a political formation with a vastly different vision of politics that was advancing and seemed to be advancing the interests of working people, whatever side of that divide, the demographic divide they happen to be on, which I think in some ways one of the more exciting things about Bernie Sanders' campaign was that he seemed to be trying to do that and seemed to be having a little bit of success. He would go and speak at a historically black college or university in South Carolina with an all-black audience, and he would give, in many ways, a very similar message. Not exactly, maybe exactly the same, but mostly the same message, whether it was about police violence or it was about this kind of bread and butter issues that he's been talking about for many decades. You give that same speech to an all-white crowd in Iowa somewhere. And he got a tremendous reception, even in South Carolina where he lost, of course. There was a lot of excitement about it, and in the end, in fact, Sanders, despite all of the hazing from the pro-Clinton people, Sanders ended up winning a majority of young African Americans and Latinos, as I understand it from the analysis of the exit polls and the regular polls. And he also won a majority of whites, including working class whites in a lot of the places where Hillary Clinton ended up losing. So, if you can imagine that multiplied, not just for 5 or 6 months, an election year, and then we go back to normal, when the image of politics that people see is just the Democrats and Republicans bickering with their divvying up system. But if we had that all year round and all 4 years round, and not just Bernie Sanders, but whatever the panoply of people in places all around the country, being able to present the same message that is attractive to working people, has working people, whatever side of this divide they happen to be on. I think that itself might have transformative impact on not just who ends up winning politics, but who ends up in the legislature or something like that, but in terms of how people out there in the country understand the political world.
All right. I think we have time for 2 more kind of questions, and because I want to leave enough. Does that sound good, Jason? I want to leave enough time for people to talk to each other and get a chance to pick up a copy of the new issue if you haven't. So I saved the difficult ones for last.
Those were the difficult ones.
There's actually a number of interesting questions about Podemos, so I didn't want to skip over these, and you can answer them as much as you want. But just sort of thinking, whether Podemos has any lessons that we can draw, and also, in terms of organization, a sort of open kind of approach in terms of communication, what you think about that.
I'm not an expert on Podemos. I think that they're dealing with similar problems that we've been dealing with. I think that as a project, Podemos was an attempt to sort of accomplish similar kinds of things to what this would be about accomplishing, but of course in a very different context. Spain as a whole. Spain is another country, as the old saying goes. That's not the problems that they face and the specific issues they face are very contextual and are very different from ours. I don't know. I do know that in Spain, like in every other country other than the United States, political parties are political parties, but they're actual political parties. They're actual voluntary organizations with their own internal rules and stuff. But of course, they also in Spain have become, like in most countries, highly bureaucratized, and the parties I'm talking about, and closed in on themselves, and a lot of people feel like that doesn't relate to me. I have no connection with that party, whether we're talking about the main center left party, the PSOE, or the main center right party, or whatever. So one of the things Podemos wanted to do was to...
The last, and I'm going to make a sort of a 2-part question. We have a number of people who are asking in a very sort of straightforward way, okay, great, how do we get about building this kind of organization? What should we actually do next? And also a number of questions asking how kind of existing movements and existing concerns about the environment, movements around sort of consumerism, right, and anti-consumerist movements, and also things like campaign finance reform, right? So these kinds of issues that people are passionate about, how would that actually, get woven into a kind of base-building movement like you're laying out here? So the sort of first part is the very practical kind of what do you think we should be doing next, and the second is kind of how do we weave in existing kind of movements, without losing kind of the essence of what they're, for climate change, for example, a lot of people feel like this is the sort of front and center movement that everyone should be uniting around and building a movement based on that. So,
in terms of what should we do now, I think that. If this number one, if this thing were to happen, or some people would file the paperwork to establish a 401c4 organization, blah blah blah. That's not. I don't think that's really the question that was being asked, though. I think that in moments in the past when a Labour Party or a left-wing party is finally organized on a significant scale, not some micro sect, but something big, it happens at the end of a process in which people spontaneously are increasingly talking about we need to get involved in direct political intervention, and you sort of a buzz of people talking, activists in various places, and so this idea comes up and then it kind of coalesces. In other words, it's not because somebody writes an article and then everybody says, oh yeah, we should do that. But rather because there's kind of a general drift towards the realization that it can't just be about whatever the last demonstration was, whatever the last street demonstration, but that there's sort of a movement of people's minds towards that idea. So one thing I would say is that in addition to being involved in all of the local struggles and organizations on the left that would inevitably filter into such a party, there should be, I think that there should be more attention paid to the electoral side of things, even today, even under the existing situation. When there are real left-wing candidates, even if they're at low-level local elections or whatever, to support those candidates, to try to connect activist struggles on the one hand with electoral work on the other hand, not necessarily because the electoral stuff is going to be the most directly important. We're not going to take over the entire political system tomorrow or after the next election, but if only in order to help, frankly, to push the left itself out of a mindset of saying that's all, that political world, elections and all that is just not for us. I think in the end we can't afford to do that. That's the best I can say. I don't have like a magic formula for us to get from here to there. I think that in terms of the question about what issues and so on, one of the points that I wanted to make in the article is that the key aspect of the kind of party that I'm proposing is that it's a democratic organization. It's up to the people who are participating in it and the institutions that participate in it to decide what it's going to be about. So it's not up to me to dictate what it would be about. I do know that I talked in my piece about the Labour Party, which was organized in the 90s for a few years, and have today, and they actually had a set of concrete proposals in their platform, and I think that makes a lot of sense as a sort of a core bundle of issues to present to the public. For one thing, because it's necessary, and for another thing, because it's a good way to kind of unite a central concern that today is still too ghettoized on the left, or liberalism, which is climate change, and with the interests of the actual day-to-day interests of a large number of people beyond the left, beyond liberalism. So after that, campaign finance, I don't know what position it would take on campaign finance. I would hope that it would at least make it a bottom line that the campaign finance system not discriminate among different parties. That would be kind of a no-brainer for what is essentially a third party a position to take. And then, on every possible issue, the left will always be able to argue about a whole laundry list of issues, and it's not, I can't predict what all of the issues that we'll get to argue about will be, but they'll be there, and all I can say is that in terms of a bottom line of what this organization would be, it would present an image, it would present a political profile that says we intend to be a party of the working class. And that's it. We intend to represent working people who are not currently represented under the the existing two parties. And from there, the sky's the limit in terms of the specific issues.
I think that sums it up well. Thank you, Seth. I didn't get to all of your questions, but I'm going to keep these questions because many of them are very thoughtful, and it's really useful to just sort of gauge sort of what people are thinking and how they're reacting. So thank you if you wrote a question. And if you have a question that you didn't get a chance to ask, you can feel free to approach us or shoot me an email or Seth an email. There are still, I believe, issues in the back if you want to pick one up if you didn't get a chance. We're selling them at a discount for $10. And if you would be so kind, if you are leaving, to please pick up your chair and fold it and lean it against the wall so we can not spend too long cleaning up the room afterwards. So thank you all for coming, and that's it.